Hello, my name is Michael Levy. I'm a neurologist, an associate professor at Harvard Medical School, and it is an honor today to address the group today on the topic of clinical trials. And first, I'll just start a little bit on slide 2 about myself. I am a neurologist and a neuroimmunologist. I manage patients with autoimmune diseases, usually the ones that cause demyelination. And I also manage patients with superficial siderosis, which is an iron overload disease for which we use deferiprone that you'll hear about later on in this session. My experience is in clinical trials. We've conducted several investigator-initiated clinical trials and also participated in large sponsored trials, and I'll describe what these are as well. And my connection to PMD is new. I'm new to this area. But because I use a lot of a medication called Feriprox or deferiprone for patients with superficial siderosis, this has become a hot topic in PMD, and I've made connections in the field. And again, it is an honor to address you today about these topics. Another area that we've dabbled in is in remyelination. We use animal models in the laboratory to develop things like stem cells, which you've heard about, but mostly our disease of interest has been in autoimmune diseases, but these can be directly applicable to PMD. So the two questions that I'll attempt to answer during this short talk are, number one, what does it take to get a drug to market in general? And what does it mean to repurpose a drug? So getting a drug to market basically involves proving to the FDA that you've identified a clinical issue that you want to improve, that you've proposed a way to improve it where the benefits outweigh the risk, and then you've proved it in a clinical trial with substantial evidence. And what you see here is a picture of the FDA building. I've been in this building several times to meet with the FDA on topics mostly on rare diseases like PMD. And I can tell you that they are genuinely interested in helping groups and companies and people get drugs to market. Now, there are basically 4 phases of this type of proof. On slide 5 here, I show that there's a preclinical phase. This is where you look at evidence in models like animal models or in culture, and you determine that there is a good rationale for proceeding to people. And then you have to convince the FDA that this is a drug that has demonstrated some safety in animals and efficacy in preclinical models, that it's worth testing in a phase 1 study. This is where you take a small group of people, usually healthy people, but not always. They may already have the disease. And you use the drug just to demonstrate that there is safety. And then there's a phase 2 of the trial. We have to enroll a lot more patients. These are the ones who have the disease. And you use phase 2 to sort out the dosage and to decide which outcome measures you want to use in your trial. The outcome measures are really critical because what the FDA is going to evaluate at the end is, did you meet your primary end goal? You said you wanted to do this with the drug. Did you meet that end goal? Because if you fixed something else with your drug, but that's not what you set out to fix, the FDA is not going to approve it. You have to decide what you're going to fix and then set out to fix it. And then in phase 3, this is where you really prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt in a rigorous clinical trial with a lot of patients. This is where you demonstrate that the drug does what you say it's going to do. And then the FDA reviews that phase 3 data and decides whether or not to approve it. After that, companies usually run phase 4 studies to just collect more data as real-world patients start to use the drug. You want to know if there are any safety signals that are going to emerge over time. That's usually part of a phase 4 study. It's important to know that for diseases like PMD, these are rare diseases, rare being defined as anything less than 200,000 patients with that disease in the US. So there are actually quite a few rare diseases, over 7,000 rare diseases. If you add them all up, rare diseases account for about the 6th most common condition in the United States, and that includes things like Alzheimer's and strokes. But each rare disease has only a few people. In the Congress, they passed an act called the Orphan Drug Act, and this basically creates financial incentives for companies to develop drugs for rare diseases. And now about 1/3 of all new FDA-approved drugs are for rare diseases. And it doesn't mean that there has to be less proof that the drug works. The level of evidence, the standards are the same, but there are just more financial incentives. So there have been a lot of new studies in rare diseases, and it makes it possible to develop a drug for a disease like PMD. In the next slide, what would the pathway for a drug for a disease like PMD look like? Well, it would start with the community of patients and caregivers and scientists picking the most promising therapies. So you've heard about a few already. There are more to come in this day's worth of talks. You have to pick the one that you think is going to work the best. That's the most promising, the most likely to work. And then you have to determine what its safety profile is. And you'll hear about some brand new therapies like stem cells that have never been used before or in very, very small studies. And for those kind of treatments, you need a lot more data on the safety side to convince, not just to convince the FDA, but to convince potential participants that this is something that is safe to pursue. Now, the dose and the outcome of a phase 2 study can sometimes be determined based on previous trials, if there are any, or based on preclinical models, if they're convincing enough. For example, how many stem cells would you use may just depend on the volume of the brain that you want to remyelinate, for example. So that may already be known in preclinical models, or it may be something that you have to determine in humans in a separate phase 2 study. And then lastly, we have to plan a big phase 3 study. That doesn't have to be huge. Let me give you some examples. In another rare disease where we recently conducted phase 3 trials, there can be as few as 55 patients. And this is a trial for which the drug was approved by the FDA. It's not necessarily the number of patients that you need, it's the scientific proof. So for example, if a drug works really, really well, then you don't need a ton of patients to prove that it really works. But if a drug only works a little bit and you're only going to see a subtle result, then you need a lot more patients to prove that beyond a benefit of the doubt. On the next slide, slide 8 here, really want to emphasize the role of funding. Funding is critical. A lot of trials never even get off the ground because there's no financial incentive. For drugs that are old, that don't have any more patent protection, pharmaceutical companies don't want to invest a lot of money in that because there's not a lot on the return side. If a company invests a lot of money to prove that a drug works, but there's no patent protection on it, then a generic can be developed and cut into the market share. But what if there is a really good drug that's old and that no longer has patent protection? Well, then it's up to the government, so government funding and philanthropy, to then come in and say, okay, this is in the best interest of the community to develop this drug. Let's fund it with public money, and in the end, then there'll be inexpensive therapies available. Now, on the other hand, if there is a new drug, one that is protected by intellectual property, then you can usually get investors or a pharmaceutical company to put up the money necessary to run these big trials. And these are very, very expensive trials, sometimes on the order of $100 million for a single phase 3 trial. Okay, so that was the first question. What does it take to get a drug to market? The second question is, what does it mean to repurpose a drug? Basically, repurposed therapies are ones for which the FDA has already approved for something else entirely. Okay, so take Tylenol. Tylenol's already been approved, long approved. Steroids have been approved. There are a lot of treatments that have already been approved by the FDA. Now you're going to go back and develop one of these approved therapies now for a different disease, like PMD. And the advantage is that the safety has already been demonstrated in humans. maybe not in your specific disease population. If there's a reason to think that PMD patients would respond differently, safety-wise, to a treatment, then you might have to demonstrate safety in the PMD population. You might already have data on dosage from previous trials in those other diseases. And again, if there's a reason that PMD patients may respond differently, you might have to develop a phase 2 study specifically for that. Just to give you an example, there are many trials that were launched in 2019 that skipped phase 1 and phase 2 and just went straight to phase 3 because they knew their drug already performed well safety-wise and dosage-wise in other disease populations. And so they jumped straight into a phase 3 trial for a new disease indication. And that's the advantage of using repurposed therapies. I put here 4 considerations for using repurposed therapies. Again, you can skip phase 1 and phase 2 sometimes if you already have that data from those other trials. And that's the big advantage. So hopefully you can jump straight into a phase 3 if you're really hopeful about that drug. And the funding and intellectual property is a little bit different here because in a repurposed therapy, there's already an FDA approval. It means the patent clock has already started, and now you have to consider how much time left that drug has of intellectual property, and companies will weigh that. They're going to say, well, if we have 5 years left of intellectual property, it's going to take 3 years to do this trial. We only have 2 years to really make money off of it. That's not enough time. We don't want to invest. But if there's more time on that intellectual property clock, they may want to invest. So let me just propose here 2 examples of what a pathway to treatment for PMD would look like. The first would be something like stem cell therapy. Okay, this would be a new treatment. You'll need preclinical data from mice, from rats, from larger animals like dogs or pigs, and whatever model makes sense to the FDA, and proof of good manufacturing practices so that it's pure and uncontaminated. And then you need funding to launch. You're going to need a lot of money just to prove that this is safe in humans. And then you're going to need funding to take it to that next step to demonstrate dosage. And then usually at this point, if you have a product that looks very promising, pharmaceutical company or a big investor will come in and say, okay, yeah, there's money to be made here. This is a new drug with lots of intellectual property to protect here. They'll usually fund that expensive phase 3 study. Another example would be a repurposed drug like deferoprone. Again, this is a drug that's already been approved. There are only a few years left of intellectual property, but you get to refer to previous data from trials like superficial siderosis, where I've used the drug, or other diseases like beta thalassemia. Then you need less funding to repurpose a drug. You can jump straight into a phase 3 efficacy study, again, assuming that you have the support of the pharmaceutical company, because right now, deferoprone is protected by maybe 1 or 2 more years of intellectual property. So I just provide these 2 as examples. There are many more opportunities in PMD, but this is the type of thing to consider when you are developing drugs for PMD. So thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.